What do you think? It's terrible.
This particular site is in a small embayment in this sound. And it's far out in the sea, and it should be very pristine there with a lot of water currents. It has been a very nice and pristine area for years. The purpose was to visit outside this farm. We were swimming across this small embayment and over to the other shore where we were closer to this pipeline coming out of the fish farm.
Over the past several decades, large swathes of kelp forests around the world have been decimated by surging populations of these spiny, boar-like creatures. Many marine scientists have attributed the urchin barrens in Norway to the decline of its natural predators due to overfishing. Some hope it's a part of a natural cycle, others believe the abundance of organic material in the water is playing a role.
The red sea urchin, Latin name Echinus esculentus, and there was thousands of it, and it was quite dense, long distance away from the pipelines, but the density was the highest at very close to the pipeline. And sea urchins, they have some suction feet, so they can climb on vertical walls as well. But it was climbing high, and it was covering all the pipeline. I think it's quite obvious that they are feeding from the organic matter that's coming out from the pipelines from the fish farm. And as a qualified guess, saying that they have a lot of food, then they produce high amounts of gonads, and then in the reproduction season, they have a very high reproduction, and they're getting a lot of larvae, and they settle, and they will increase their populations. There have been observed 2 years ago, and now there was much higher densities than 2 years earlier. We also turned around some stones in the area, and we saw these tiny juvenile red urchins that was hiding among stones. So actually they are living in a kind of shelter when they are small, and then when they are getting bigger, they are more brave and they can go out and feed in the open. These red urchins will increase in numbers, so if they have very good food conditions, they can stick together and they spawn.
In the waters around the salmon hatchery in the Lofoten Islands, senior scientist Hartvig Christie is observing an alarming event he has never seen before. At least not with this type of urchin, and certainly not in these numbers. Hartvig believes this small part of the Arctic coast has the perfect conditions for a new invasion. He explains that the young sea urchins thrive on organic matter, making this area an ideal breeding ground. With plenty of food available, these urchins grow quickly and soon dominate the entire ecosystem. As Hartvig moves away from the clusters of red sea urchins near the hatchery pipes, he points out something else, a dense population of black brittle stars. Like the urchins, these creatures also benefit from the organic material coming from the pipes, showing just how much this environment has been shaped and altered by human activity. Farther out, in the ever-turning tidal currents towards the ocean-based fish farm nets, Hartvig observes a struggling kelp forest. The kelp plants here are small, their blades coated with epiphytic growth, a clear sign they're under stress. Healthy kelp should have a vibrant brown color, but these plants are far from that. Hartvig also notices that much of the surrounding area has been stripped clean by the grazing hordes of hungry small newborn urchins carried there by the currents. The rocks, ropes, quays, and even the seabed, once covered in vegetation, are now barren, grazed clean by the urchins. It's a stark reminder of how these outbreaks can transform an underwater landscape. How many scenes like this are out there, hidden from sight? Observations by scientists here and elsewhere make it clear that this isn't just an isolated episode. It's a vivid example of how delicate marine ecosystems are, and how human activities can tip the balance, with far-reaching consequences.
So this should be man-made, and of course when you just find it around a pipeline where you see all these organic matter is coming out. It's quite obvious that this is due to the fish farm, because we have been snorkeling other places around in Lofoten and we find these red sea urchins, one here and one there. They are quite rare. In these areas, for hundreds of years, they have been very pristine and nice kelp forests.
According to reports, an estimated 5,000 square kilometers of Norwegian kelp forests have already been consumed by these determined spiny grazers. Urchin barrens and underwater deserts now stretch from the Russian border in the far north to areas south of the Lofoten Islands.
As a good thing, we see that if you clean and if you make the conditions better, the kelp will come back by itself and produce a new kelp forest if you take care of the environment.
But there is hope. Scientists, entrepreneurs and activists are all working to combat this growing invasion. Some are even finding ways to clean it up and turn it into a business opportunity. Follow senior scientist Hartvig Christie and our team at Reflections for more stories like this.